Good morning, Highland readers. We are ready for Chapter 5 in the Lottery Rose. Please open it on your Chromebook and your facts. And that way we have two tabs going while we're reading and watching this so that we can add to our 50 facts. We're ready for Chapter 5, and that is page 66. I saw her, Georgie. I don't know where she got it, but I saw her throw your rosebush down on the playground or the back playground hard, like she was mad and hated it. Timothy's eyes were wide as he stood in the doorway of Georgie's Georgie's room. Georgie froze beside his bed where he was trying with trembling hands to dress himself before the gong rang for breakfast. He stared back at Timothy, his eyes as wide as his friend's and much more frightened. She came up to Sister Dolores in the foyer, and I heard her say she wanted to see Sister Mary Angela right away. And she wasn't kidding. She meant right away. He frowned, puzzled, and plainly worried for Georgie. Why do you suppose she wanted to be throwing your bush around? He said. I planted it in her garden last night, Georgie said wretchedly. He hurried past Timothy, pulling his shirt half over his shoulders as he ran down toward the door. Timothy, watching him, clasped one hand to his head, partly in mock and partly in real horror. Why was Timothy so shocked? What had he seen? Georgie's back. Okay, remember the beating that Steve gave him? Timothy finally saw Georgie's back. Georgie found his forlorn bush lying on the playground, and he gathered it to him, as he had when the policeman rescued it from the janitor's trash barrels. The boys were all at breakfast by that time, and no one saw how tenderly he lifted his bush, holding it close to him. In less than 2 minutes, he was back at the garden fence, carrying the bush in his good arm, his thin face white with sickness inside him and the anger. He strode through the gate as if he were as tall as any man, and he walked down to the spot where a shallow hole in the sand marked the place that he had given his rose the night before. When he approached it, he saw to his dismay that a dozen or more delicate lilies just ready to bloom had been broken or crushed by his feet the night before. So in his haste to plant the rose bush, he'd made some of the lilies, he dug them up accidentally and probably killed them. That some of the bulbs were lying on the ground, exposed to the hot sunlight, remorsefully, so with sorrow. He was upset, with remorse, like he was apologetic. He knelt and lifted plant after broken plant, trying to replace them in their bed, pressing sand firmly about them and digging holes in which he buried the bulbs that had been upturned. He was still working when Molly Harper stepped up quietly beside him. Her voice was harsh when she called Georgie's attention to her presence. I tore that bush out of the ground and threw it across the street a while ago, she told him, her blue eyes almost black with anger. My husband planted those calla lily bulbs for me here as a surprise because he knew I especially loved them every spring since then. She broke off, and her voice grew more bitter than ever. You ruined a dozen or more of them last night. You disobeyed both sister and my father. And you came over here and ruined my lilies. Georgie was on his feet, facing her, his bush close in his arms. It was dark. I didn't mean to hurt them. Well, you did hurt them. And you came over here when you knew perfectly well that you had no right to be here. She threw her braids back over her shoulders, and Georgie thought they looked like yellow whips growing out of her head. She took a step nearer to him. Understand this, Georgie, once and for all. If I ever find that bush here again, I'll pull it up and throw it in the incinerator. Okay, an incinerator's where you burn garbage. Believe me, I mean that. Now get out of here this minute, and don't ever let me see either you or your bush in this garden again. At her words, Georgie gave the shrill cry that had never failed to arouse Steve's rage. He glared at Molly like a furious little animal. If you ever do it, I'll set fire to your house. I'll kill you dead. I'll do the meanest things to you that ever happened. His voice choked with dry sobs that shook his body, and he took a step towards her, and his brown hands clenched tightly, his face intense and desperate, and then without warning, he crumpled and fell at her feet, repeating something over and over. She had to lean down to hear the words. They were, "Have to plant it here, have to plant it here." The left side of his shirt had been hung loosely over the cast on his arm, and as he rolled from one side to the other, it fell off, and Molly Harper had her first glimpse of an evil she hadn't guessed was there. It was purple and red mass of swollen flesh, welts and knots imposed one upon another, some of them beginning to heal and some of them oozing the yellowish liquid of infection. She stared in disbelief for several seconds, then she leaned down and touched the mutilated flesh. "How did this happen, Georgie? Why were you hurt like this?" she asked hoarsely. He sat up quickly and pushed her from him. "Don't you look at my back! Nobody can see my back except people in the hospital. Don't you ever dare look at my back again," he said, his voice replaced by a hard coldness. She stood looking down at him, her face now as white as his. "I am not going to join the club of brutes, Georgie. Stay here with your bush. I have to find Sister Mary Angela." He hadn't understood her words. The storm inside him made words and garden a strange, angry woman, and even a rosebush seemed dim and far away. He lay in the sand, tired and hopeless. He didn't dare plant his bush again, for the threat of the incinerator still rang in his ears. And on the other hand, a fierce anger against the adults around him, who would not understand, hardened his determination to see that the rose remained in the garden where he knew it belonged. It seemed that a long time passed while the sun grew hotter and more hurtful. His brain had shining wheels in it that turned faster and faster, making him dizzy and sick. "Maybe we're going to die, both of us," he whispered to the bush beside him. He closed his eyes and did not know that Sister Mary Angela tried to waken him, or that Mrs. Harper picked him up in her arms and carried him across the street to his room. Chapter 6, page 71. Georgie's fever ran high for 5 full days, and during most of that time he tossed about in a delirium, unaware of the need to protect the unhealed wounds on his back. With the resultant stinging which spread all over his back and buttocks, a picture of Steve materialized in his brain and filled him with terror. At such time, Georgie's shrieks were terrible to hear, and Sister Mary Angela's face was drawn as she bent over him, trying to soothe and comfort him. At other times it was the safety of the rosebush that disturbed him. He saw it in his dreams, thrown like trash beside the calla lilies and scorned by proud flowers that turned into jeering boys. "Hello, ugly," they whispered at first so that none of the sisters could hear him. "Who beat the out of you, ugly?" The voices then grew so loud at times that Georgie went wild with the din they set up in his brain. And as if she wanted to add to his distress, the woman with blazing eyes and long yellow whips of hair over her shoulders advanced toward the rose bush. What she intended to do with it was all too plain as she picked it up and dragged it away toward barrels filled with litter. It was this vision of the woman that renewed the threats that Georgie had made in the garden. "I'll burn your house! I'll kill you dead!" he told the Molly Harper of his delirium, while the real Molly Harper stood at Sister Mary Angela's side and tried to soothe him. Okay, Team Alabama, let's add a few vocab words. The word delirium and soothe. Please add those at this time, and let's add 2 new facts. Have a great rest of your day.